The First World War. One of the largest, most devastating conflicts in human history. A cataclysmic clash that lasted 4 years, destroyed empires, and consumed millions. And that is important to note, for the Great War is not simply a label on history books, an interval between two dates. It was a brutal reality that left incomprehensible heartbreak and destruction in its wake, and many of those that survived its dangers were forever scarred by its horrors. An entire generation was lost to the world, and its consequences echo still to this day, even if it is difficult to imagine what it was like to live through such a conflict, and even if it is difficult to unbury some of the darkest sides of humanity and observe them directly. One must never forget that those who lived through it were real people. They have stories to tell us, and we would do well not to forget the past. And so we come to one of those stories, the story of one man, the story of Corporal Louis Barthas. Louis Barthas was a barrelmaker born in 1879 in southern France, and who for most of his life lived in the small village of Périac-Minervois. As a child he was a bright student, but the economic hardships of his family made it so that he had to take up his father's profession and abandon his studies, though he continued his education on his own. When the Great War broke out in 1914, Barthas was 35 years old with 2 children, one 8 and the other 6. He was soon enlisted and served for the entire duration of the war until February 1919. Most of that time directly on the front line, with only the briefest of rests and leaves. As a socialist and fervent pacifist, he deeply hated the war and all the senseless death and misery it caused, but still he served and survived in some of its deadliest battlefields, including names such as Flanders, the Somme, and Verdun. In his service, Barthas suffered hardships beyond imagining and faced many horrors. He survived the sickness and misery of the trenches, horribly taxing overwork, the abuses and negligence of superiors, unsupported charges against machine guns, brutal bombardments, and even flamethrower attacks. Most noteworthy of Corporal Louis Barthas, besides the fact that he survived so much, is that he was willing to share his experiences. During his service, he wrote a diary that kept growing until it filled 19 mud-splattered notebooks. He worked on it carefully after the war to tell not only his story, but the story of his comrades, of their suffering and the injustices of the war. His is not the perspective of the French officer, but the perspective of the French common soldier, the poilu, as they were nicknamed. As he said in one of his notes when referring to the officers, "To them, the soldier doesn't open up, is mistrustful, and any officer who will want to try, like me, to describe the strange life of the trenches will have never known, except by accident, the real sentiments, the true spirit, the clear language and the deepest thoughts of the soldier." As a corporal, Louis Barthas lived with his men, ate with his men, and fought with his men, and so Barthas knew their story, a story they themselves urged him to write down and tell to posterity. After finishing his work, Barthas put the notebooks away in a drawer. He was a mere barrel maker from a small village with no hopes of ever publishing them, so the notebooks stayed hidden away in that drawer for years. Fortunately, they were eventually rediscovered, though long after Barthas's death, and the world can finally hear what he had to say. And so, in this series, we shall tell the story of Louis Barthas, corporal and barrel maker, as is written down in those 19 notebooks, identical to the ones he used during his schoolboy days. These 19 notebooks form a document of great historical value, so we will dedicate an episode to each of them. I hope you enjoy this story as much as I have. Until next time.